שלום, שלום רב לכולם. נא להיכנס ולסגור את הדלתות. צהריים טובים לכולם, אנחנו מתחילים עכשיו. לכל דוברי העברית, מי שצריך תרגום סימולטני, יכול לקחת אוזניות בחוץ, כי המושב יהיה באנגלית. And with your permission, I'm moving to English. This session will be taken in English since we are bringing a global overview of the energy transition. We kept it in English. I welcome everybody here, and for me personally, to be here is nice to be back after my absence for the last year, but I was watching from abroad, and I hope that today and in the coming 3 days we manage to gather together in order to understand, to learn from each other, to meet, to mingle, and try to enrich each other. So thank you very much everybody for coming, and special thanks for our honored guests from abroad. Thank you for coming and being here with us today. You see the program on the slide. We have here today 3 world experts. One is Israeli, one bringing the EU perspective, and one the US perspective of the energy transition. We will begin with a short intro, and then we will go through all 3 perspectives and to see what's going on in our industry in the energy transition. So, majority of the UN sustainable goals, out of the 17 goals, something like half of them is related directly to the energy transition. And succeeding the energy transition, meaning succeeding saving the world and bringing us to a sustainable world. You can see here, of course, the energy and climate change. You can see here even no hunger and no poverty. All those goals cannot achieve without the success of the energy transition. And all are heavily dependent on it. But what is going on worldwide? 3 vectors have faced the world in the last couple of years. The first one is the pandemic. We are just going out of the pandemic, but the pandemic is still here. We are approaching the winter, and nobody can tell where we are going with the pandemic, and either another one or a different one, but definitely the world has gone through a tremendous change through the pandemic. On one hand, for the first time, we experienced a reduction in CO2 emission, but that was due to an economic slowdown, which is not good for the world and for the sustainable world. But on the other hand, we are coming out now with a rapid growth, which is making achieving those sustainable goals even harder. What we have learned from that, there are several lessons that have been learned, and much of them are related to the energy transition. On the other hand, we're facing now one of the world's biggest challenge with the Ukraine crisis. This is since the 70s, the Yom Kippur crisis that was originated here in the Middle East, and now in Europe. This is 50 years from there, we are again in an energy crisis, which is turning upside down the whole world order. We will hear from the expert that here how it is impacting each and every one of region of the world. And you can see here in this map that there is an increasing risk worldwide, both in Europe, in Africa, in Latin America, and almost everywhere due to this crisis, which make the energy transition even harder. We have just now reduced or didn't even managed to reduce any of CO2 emission during the last year, just due to the fact that we are now facing these crises that will be described later more elaborately. The third vector, which is also related, which is all connected, is the economics. Eventually, everything is tied up, and now we are facing an inflation rate which reached a 2-digit percentage in most of the Western world. We already saw the broken supply chain and its impact during the last several years, and we are even facing a risk of a world recession from economic point of view, and global leaders, the World Bank, and also governments are now thinking hard how to go out again after the pandemic, after pouring billions and trillions to the market, how to make the market work without a recession. That's a huge challenge. So we faced 3 vectors. All those are quite negative, but I want to hand over the stage with an optimistic overview and what should the world do. Some 300 kilometers from here, world leaders are gathered and they have one mission. Their one mission is to unite the world and to achieve a workable program how to save our planet. This is a much difficult mission. Last year in Glasgow, the world reached the understanding of the urgency that we are facing, but the Ukraine crisis make it almost impossible to promote those targets agreed last year. This year, the world, with the absence of global leaders like China, which are not attending this conference and are major player to achieve this goal, it's becoming even more harder. Everybody and the General Council of the UN just declared that the world is actually either have a plan to go for net zero for 2050 or it's a program for a global suicide. As simple as that. So I hope that by the end of next week, with the closure of the Sharm el-Sheikh conference, we will have a declaration we hope to the world. And with that, I will introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker will bring the EU perspective, which is the most heavily impacted from the Ukraine crisis. Mr. Prajeev Asiya is an Executive Vice President and Regional Director of DNV Energy System Northern Europe Operation. He leads a team of 1,100 energy experts that work with customers across the energy value chain to support their transition to decarbonize the energy system. Prajeev has 25 years of experience across both the oil and gas and the power and renewable industry. He joined DNV in 2007 as a principal consultant and has since held various leadership roles, including area manager and executive vice president for different businesses area in geographic across the world. Prior to joining DNV, Prajeev has various technical and management consultancy roles with Jardine, Schlumberger, and KPMG. Prajeev has a technical background with Bachelor of Engineering in Aeronautical Engineering from Imperial College University of London and MBA from Hellenic Management College University of Reading. He is a fellow and chartered director at the Institute of Director London. Prajeev, you are welcome to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barmas. Thanks for the kind introduction. And also thanks for having me back. It's great to be back here in Israel and also back at this conference after 3 years. I hope you can hear me well. Yep. So yes, good afternoon. Shalom. Great to be back and to be speaking to you about the EU perspective. But before I go there, just to introduce DNV, for those of you who don't know DNV, we are a company that was founded in 1864, so we've been around for 158 years with the purpose of safeguarding life, property, and the environment. We're a global, independent risk management and technical assurance company. We work mainly in the maritime sector, the energy sector, food, and healthcare. Many of you don't know that we are a foundation, so we don't have shareholders. That gives us the independence, but also the mandate to spend 5% of our revenues in good years and bad on R&D, research and development, to drive the industries that we work in with the standards, the technical standards, to improve those industries. And part of that investment also goes into thought leadership, of which one is this energy transition outlook, which we issue every year. This is our view on how the energy transition will unfold based on our understanding of technology and their cost trajectory, and also policies and how they will evolve as well. So I will use that as the basis to give my view, first globally about the energy transition, and then also to give you the EU perspective. I know Mr. Balmer said we should have an optimistic view about the energy transition. I'm afraid my first slide is a bit depressing. Our findings, the key takeaway is that the world is not on a good path to achieving net zero by 2050. We still think the 1.5 degree future is possible. In fact, what we are predicting is that the most likely scenario, according to our understanding of the technology trajectory and the policy trajectory, more importantly, is that we will hit 2.2 degrees by 2100. But we still think 1.5 degrees is possible, but it will require massive action, starting, it says today, but it should have been yesterday, because to achieve net zero, we should be reducing our emissions by 8% a year. We managed a little bit of that during COVID lockdowns, around 6%, but last year it went in the opposite direction. This year we might be able to achieve a 1% reduction, so far short of the 8%. So we are falling short and we need to do actions yesterday. Also, the existential crisis or the existential threat that we face from climate change is not a country issue. It's not isolated to one country. As you can see, the floods happening in Australia, in the US, in Pakistan. So the solutions you have to have it holistically. One country alone cannot solve this. So cross-border collaboration is important, not least to optimize cost-effectively how we tackle this problem. And then the same goes for the way we think about the energy system. It needs to be holistic. A full energy systems thinking needs to be had in terms of what technologies we need to scale up and what we need to scale down to achieve the 1.5 degree target and net zero by 2050. So we think technology-wise, we are optimistic. We believe that the technologies that exist now are sufficient to get us to net zero. But what we're pessimistic about is the policies and the governance around it and the implementation of policies. And that's where we hope Sharm el-Sheikh will come up with some solutions then. So if we look at our projections, so in terms of emissions, we're at about 38 gigatons a year of emissions. And we need to bring that down to zero by 2050. But our most likely forecast is that it will still be around 22 gigatons by 2050 and only coming down to zero by 2100. There is a pathway to net zero. There's another report that we also issue where this is possible, but it will require a much faster decarbonization of our energy systems, and some regions will need to go faster to net zero so that other regions have the ability to then also catch up in later years. So we have two reports. They're free to download on our website at dnv.com. which then outline the most likely scenario and what needs to be done to get to a net zero future by 2050. And here you can see a snapshot of the energy transition that we predict. The first one shows the most likely scenario, which will take us to a 2.2 degree temperature rise by 2100. And there you see that the energy system, which is currently 80% fossil fuel based and 20% non-fossil fuel based, will come down to roughly half and half by 2050. And that will take us to 2.2 degrees. And our pathway to net zero will require a doubling of the decarbonization required to achieve the nearly 80-20 split by 2050. So we need the reverse of what we have now by 2050 to achieve net zero and to achieve a 1.5 degree temperature rise by 2100. Because as you know, going beyond that will lead to catastrophic climate change. So that's been the global view, and just to summarize there, that we're not on the pathway to net zero, but it is possible with strong policy implementation. To reach 1.5 degrees, some regions and sectors need to go faster to achieve net zero, so we think that the European Union, the US, OECD, Pacific need to achieve net zero much earlier than 2050 to allow emerging economies more time to achieve net zero. And also some industry sectors, like power generation, need to get to net zero before 2050. We know that the technologies that exist are sufficient. Renewable electricity, hydrogen, bioenergy are essential, but insufficient. So we need to go further, and carbon capture and carbon removal will be important to get to net zero. And as I mentioned, we're already late. Time is of the essence. We need to move faster to get to 1.5 degrees, and it's about having the right policies implemented to achieve this. It's not about technology. So that's been the global view. Now, if we take a European perspective, from a policy standpoint, European Union has been moving forward. They had the Green Deal agreed at the end of 2019, before COVID, which also gave an update after COVID, called Fit for 55, where they increased the ambitions to reduce emissions by 55% by 2030 when compared to 1990 levels. So that is a massive increase. And as part of that, they also came up with the RE-Power EU initiative this year, also in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to speed up the amount of renewable energy in the mix from 40% to 45% by 2030. And also maintaining the energy efficiency improvement target of 32.5% by 2030. So these are the main policies that are driving the energy transition in the EU, and there is funding behind it through the EU Green Deal. And further to that, countries have taken the initiative, so coming together, this is where I mentioned cross-regional collaboration is important. And there are two agreements that were made this year, named after two Danish cities. One is Esbjerg, and the other one is Marienburg. And if we take the Esbjerg one, 4 North Sea countries, namely Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium, came together to sign an agreement that they will have 65 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and 20 gigawatts of green hydrogen produced by 2030. And they also agreed interconnections, because again, the system thinking here, one country alone cannot, from a grid standpoint, absorb all that energy. So they need to have this flexibility through interconnections to optimize the amount of capex that they will need, but also from a spatial planning standpoint, that helps. There is also an energy island in the North Sea that is mooted to help, not least to manage the grid connection challenges, but also to give flexibility in terms of turning excess power to green hydrogen or ammonia that can be used for other uses, like marine transportation. So this is where you need a system thinking, as I mentioned earlier. So I think The other agreement, Marienborg, also talks about, that brings together the Baltic countries, so Denmark, Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states. Again, looking at offshore wind, around 20 gigawatts of capacity that is untapped in the Baltic Sea, but also looking at green fuels, ammonia production for the marine sector. So these are examples of initiatives that are being taken by countries, fostering cross-regional collaboration, but now this needs to move into implementation and beyond just ambitions and targets on paper. And as mentioned, the war in Ukraine has created a crisis, energy crisis, and in the short term we will take a step back, where then energy security has come to the fore as a priority over decarbonization. And as you're aware, some countries are going back to coal in the short term, importing gas from other sources as alternatives to Russian gas, which would mean that, yes, from a decarbonization standpoint, there will be a short-term impact to get us through this winter and possibly the next one. However, in the long run, the drivers for the energy transition are much stronger. And the EU also realizes that the energy transition and energy security are coupled, intertwined. Energy independence will only come once we are not reliant on other countries or other regions to supply our energy. And renewables are a fast way of getting there. So as I mentioned also, that emissions is another area that we need to focus on to bring it down faster than we are doing right now to achieve the energy transition. So if we look at now at a macro level, how EU is faring and is forecast to fare, if you look at the population between, say, 2020 and 2050, the population is relatively stable, around 540 million people. The energy use, though, will go down, even though GDP is growing. So GDP per person is going up by about 50%, whereas the energy use per person is coming down. So this is a decoupling, which decouples the trend that we've seen since the age of industrialization, where GDP growth was closely correlated with energy use growth as well per capita. But now you see a decoupling where we see GDP growing by 50% per capita, but energy use per person is coming down by almost 20%. And that is because of electrification and energy efficiency. With electrification, you need less energy for the same job to be done. And therefore, emissions are also forecast to come down per capita as a result of this. And you see that in the energy demand. We believe already that the energy demand has plateaued in the European Union, and it's forecast to come down quite significantly. And you see the transport sector, through electrification of transport, coming down quite significantly. The building sector is almost stable, even though energy use will go up. It becomes more efficient to use electrification. Manufacturing is almost stable, as is other non-energy use, such as petrochemical production. Then if you look at how we're meeting that demand, you see that on top, the electricity vector is almost doubling from where we are today. So this is where electrification of demand is being met by electricity as the main vector that is growing fastest between now and 2050. We also see other forms of e-fuels, ammonia, hydrogen also taking a bigger share than they do today, and the fossil-based energy almost halving by between now and 2050, so coming down almost to half the levels we see today. So there is a decarbonization of the energy mix over the next 30 years in Europe. And if you look at the electricity vector, you see where the supply is coming from. And over 2/3 will come from wind and solar. So over 2/3 will be wind and solar of some form. And then if you add hydro and bioenergy and geothermal, that's more than 80% of the electricity demand will be met by renewable sources. If you add nuclear, then that's almost 95% and above is non-fossil based energy by 2050 in Europe. So fossil-based fuel is almost wiped out by 2050, which is needed to get to net zero. But as I mentioned, that some sectors need to go faster, so we believe that this particular sector needs to phase out fossil fuels and emissions faster than what is shown here. We also see hydrogen demand increasing, because for hard-to-abate sectors, this is a solution. We see that by 2050, globally, only 5% of the energy mix will be hydrogen, so it does take time to scale hydrogen. But in Europe, that will be almost double what you see globally, but still a small fraction. And here we see what we predict is that the green hydrogen will play a dominant role by 2050, but blue hydrogen will be the one to scale first, and then green hydrogen will take over by 2050. And finally, on the emissions side of things, we see that emissions will fall to about 0.6 gigatons per annum, but it's still not net zero. So between now and 2030, emissions will fall by 48%, so still short of the 55% target I mentioned. But also you see that we don't in Europe, or at least we're not forecasting that Europe will achieve net zero by 2050. There will still be some residual emissions that still need to be tackled. So there's still some areas for improvement, even though we are decarbonizing or forecasting that emissions will come down quite fast. So to conclude, I think the policies are in place, but implementation needs to go faster. The Ukraine conflict will create some short-term impact, but the long-term trajectory will far outweigh the short-term issues that we're having this winter and next winter. And the energy transition is underway in Europe. When compared to, say, in the last 3 decades, fossil fuels share of the energy mix in Europe has come down from 92% to 70% today, and it's forecast to go down to 28% of the energy mix by 2050. So the energy transition is rapidly unfolding in Europe, but it's not enough. We believe that we can do more in Europe, and it needs to transition much sooner to net zero by 2050 to achieve 1.5 degrees globally. With that, I'll conclude, and thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Pajiv. That was interesting. We are going back. No, we are there. Just stop. I will take it. Now we go to the next second speaker, Michael Pastor. Mike is the Chief Business Strategy Officer of Energix, Chesapeake consulting company in the United States. In his role, he oversees the most complex consulting projects involving grid modernization, electricity market, wind, solar, storage, and EV developments. For over 13 years, Mike has been providing consulting services to utilities in North America, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. He holds a master's degree in electrical engineering as well as executive education from Columbia University. He is passionate about energy transition, new technology, and most important, as an Italian origin, soccer. So, Mike, you're welcome to the stage.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor. And first, personal note. Recently, my father unfortunately passed away. He was an engineer, a consultant, author of several books, and an excellent public speaker. So I hope being here with these great leaders he would be proud of me right now. So let's start with my presentation. It's focused on the US electric grid, and we're talking about different topics that we're already kind of shared in the discussion. So we're talking about the decarbonization of the grid that will happen, but needs to happen faster, at a faster pace. The other trend that has been affecting this scenario is the decentralization of the energy resources. And then we're going to talk about how an effort to democratize the access to the grid, which is also a very important issue that we are seeing as the market opens. And finally, of course, the digital impacts that all of this is, we see that in every kind of technology. First, a little bit of introduction about the US grid. Actually, there's no single US grid, but there are three different synchronous areas, the Eastern Interconnection, Western Interconnection, and ERCOT, with very limited exchange of power between those grids. And we have, let's say, there's no energy market, but there's the sector is very much fragmented in the US with thousands of utilities that are regulated through different levels at the state level, at the federal level, and there are a lot of ISO, like NOGA here, that are being managing the system for a few years now, with some challenges, as we will see later. So some recent developments on the policies that are happening. So very recently in August, there was this Inflation Reduction Act that was proposed, and we'll see what will happen. Elections were held yesterday, so we'll see if this will go further with the new government, with the new House. But hopefully, this will be a big push by the United States to accelerate their efforts on climate change. And as you can see, there's a split between the transportation sector, the industry, and the power sector. And most of the money, of course, is going into that direction of reducing emissions from those sectors. The power generation in the US has changed quite a bit in the last 10 years, mostly because of the shale gas revolution. So there was a sharp decline in coal usage that fell almost 50%, while on the contrary, gas exploitation has increased by more than 50%. So now it's the biggest source of energy that is fueling the US power grid. While as well, solar and wind has been growing steadily to cover now about 15% of the US production. So the about 150 million customers that are connected to the grid are spread around 40% more or less residential customers. Then we have around 35% commercial use of electricity, while the industry is around 25 and declining. We see that right now the electric energy consumption of the transportation sector is very low, but is forecasted to increase because of the shift into the electric vehicle use. So going forward, good news is that over 77% of the new capacity that is being installed in 2021 in the US was coming from wind and solar. But at the same time, there are some challenges to the sector in states that are, let's say, the most, where the penetration of solar is very high, like California. They have been some challenges in managing that uncertainty. And that's quite surprising because California is just recently got to the fourth global economy. You do not expect to see rolling blackouts in a very advanced economy, but that's what happened in 2020. And unfortunately, there was a high risk of that happening again just a few months ago. But the good news is that deployment of demand response and energy storage actually saved the day. And the alert that the California and independent system operator dispatch for potential rolling blackouts for early September was actually not executed. So the system was able to deliver the power to their customers. So that's some good news. As I said, many states, the energy sector is directed at the federal level, but the states have the final authority, and many are already committing to 100% renewables or net zero or even net negative. Some utilities are trying to set that as a goal. So there is definitely a push, not as fast as we would like to see it, but there are some struggle. And one of the bottlenecks, of course, can be the grid and how fast the grid can accept that new power that is being installed. There's a lot of talk about reforming the interconnection process. So right now there's over 1,000 gigawatts in the interconnection queue in the US, and most of it is coming from solar and storage. And the other the biggest source of generation would be wind. And this is something that is still in the process of trying to find the best way on how to connect these new resources that are coming online, both at the bulk system level, so the high voltage transmission, but also at the lower level, so at the distribution level. And as we can see, reaching kind of the decarbonization of the electric sector needs to accelerate from the current levels to have it at a stable pace. So talking about the distributed energy resources, so the decentralization of the electric sector, of course we see that the PV is one of the sources that are going to be installed and are being installed extensively in a distributed fashion, but the other important and revolutionary technologies that will impact the system are electric vehicles. So electric vehicles will have to change how we operate and plan the grid because of the impacts that will have on the system, and how important will be to find ways to smart charge the vehicles will be fundamental for having a stable network. So the technology is there. The issues are how to apply it in scale and how to manage and control those assets that are actually idle most of the time. Just, the electric vehicles are used, all vehicles in general, private vehicles are used just a couple of hours a day on average. The rest of the 20 hours are assets that are not being leveraged for potential other uses that can help integrate renewables. As well as new business models because of new actors coming in this arena, so the charging point operators, how those will communicate and collect data and exchange it with the grid operators, the customers, how to make that work. It will be, of course, one of the major challenges of the near future. But there are some interesting things that are happening right now in the US around this. And I wanted to share that example of a utility in Florida trying to find new ways of attracting customers to electric vehicles and incentivize them to accept smart charging opportunities. So this utility in Florida established this program that it's a monthly fee of $31 for unlimited charging during nights and during weekends. So it's when I saw that, I thought that it was an impressive achievement from that utility to be able to accept the risk of selling that energy for a very low fee for a reward of potentially controlling the assets and leveraging the flexibility of the assets when the utility is in need. So you see that's a way of how this revolution and the flexibility of the asset can benefit both the utility and the consumer. And of course, other assets that are usually not utilized fully are another example. If you see US movies, the school buses, there are around 500,000 school buses in the US, and those are operating just for a couple of hours a day, just during the weekdays, and for the rest of the time they are sitting idle. Of course, this is a tremendous opportunity to leverage those batteries for providing services, and hundreds of gigawatt hours could be available for the grid in that scenario. Going forward, of course, this revolution for the electric sector is coming with more and more data, and data is the new oil, as economists is saying. But oil is valuable only if it's refined, and as data is the same way. So the utilities that are collecting that data around the world, they need to improve the way they leverage that data to provide services and service their customers in the best way possible. There is a global effort in understanding better the networks that for the transmission sector has always been extremely detailed, the knowledge and understanding of electrical network. For the distribution sector, since it's more spread around the country and less monitored, now it's really the focus on collecting data from those networks and leverage it to better understand and serve the customers. On the how to democratize the grid, so to give access and opportunities for the the developers that want to interconnect. I think it's very important to share that information to the market, and how U.S. utilities are trying to do that. A few examples. The first one is from a utility called Southern California Edison, serving the south of California. They publish this hosting capacity map with detailed information about the grid, and for every node of the distribution grid, they provide to the customers availability of network capacity to interconnect potential resources, so that the developers of solar or storage, they know exactly in advance if they will be able to connect in an expedite way, or they will have to wait for upgrades of the grid. So I think it's very important to prioritize decision for people that want to interconnect to the network. And same thing, for example, in the utility in New York, serving Manhattan and the New York area, they publish those maps that will exchange with the customers information about how much EVs can every single node of the network accept, so that the charging point developers can already target areas that have available capacity. And of course, there's how the prices, the markets are operated in the US is quite different from Europe. So there's a nodal pricing mechanism versus the zonal prices. This will give a little bit more granular information to participants in the electrical markets on where potentially there are opportunities by formation of negative prices, for example, or particularly high prices that will, let's say, need some further generation to be installed in that area, or network developments to relieve congestion. As well as going back to the interconnection, different policies, which ones are the best, is still something that is being studied for optimizing the connection of both power generation and electrical vehicles. And finally, it is still, I think, on the regulator to really try to understand how to socialize some of those costs of upgrading the networks to integrate renewables and connect electric vehicles, because of course right now electric vehicles are still quite expensive, and so wealthy people are installing it, but the upgrades that are needed to install electric vehicle chargers and for the network, the cost that the network is sustaining to interconnect and fuel those vehicles is carried out by the full population that is paying their electric bills. So some thoughts on how the democratization of the grid is still in process. So the final comments on can we manage that complexity? So a lot of data coming in, millions of assets that we need to control. In the past, the electrical network was operated mainly based on physics. So there were big masses rotating that kind of try to self-regulate in a certain sense. There's, of course, the human interaction in understanding what's happening has been powering our lives for a century, more than a century, and already many sophisticated algorithms are helping running the networks. But as we go to kind of to a future integration of more and more assets, definitely there needs to be something more sophisticated to control. And at one point, I believe we will need to kind of shift a little bit the operation of the network to some algorithm. And I think it's funny that one of my favorite authors, Yuval Harari, it's from Israel, and it's been one of the main kind of speakers and authors on this topic. So this is some final thoughts about this opportunity and change that will I see coming in the near future. So thank you very much for having me here. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Mike, for the interesting overview of the US. And the next speaker needs no introduction, but for the protocol, I will introduce him as the other. Mr. Chen Herzog, partner, is the chief economist of BDO Consulting Israel, has more than 25 years professional experience in economic consulting and advisory for international cooperation, government-owned entities, and large companies in Israel. He holds an MA degree in economics from the Tel Aviv University. And I'm welcoming my friend Chen to the stage to bring the Israeli perspective. Chen, בבקשה.
צהריים טובים. אני רוצה לדבר על האתגרים של... In English? Okay. All my friends here yeah, no, after 3 days in the Sharm Sheikh conference in English, that will be... So, I want to talk about the challenges of the Israeli energy sector, and I think these challenges today of planning and forward-looking are emphasized because we are in the middle of two global crises. Energy crisis as a consequence of the Ukraine war, and a climate crisis. So when we are planning Israel's energy sector, and both of these crises, by the way, are not local, they're global. They don't come from here. But when we plan our own energy system looking forward, we need to understand and to assess how these crises affect us. And if we're talking about the global energy crisis, and if you look at the global perspective of all crises, because we say, okay, it's an unpredictable crisis. Who could imagine that we'll have a war in Ukraine when we planned our energy systems? And of course, nobody knew. But if you look at the history, you will see that on average, once every decade, unfortunately, we have some unforeseen crisis. From the 1973 Yom Kippur War to the Gulf War and the Iran-Iraq War and the Arab Spring crisis. So when we plan for the next decades, we don't know when the next crisis will happen, but we need to understand and be prepared for that. And that's a challenge. Because when we economists create long-term plans and we assume forecasts and numbers, we always plan on average. We say this will be the average oil price, this will be the average coal price, gas price, but we need to understand and build resilience because we know for certain there will be another crisis. We don't know when, we don't know why, and we need to prepare for that. And I think this is emphasized also in terms of the climate challenge and the climate goals. This morning I came back from the COP27 convention in Sharm el-Sheikh, but if you recall 1 year back, at the end of the COP26 convention, the dispute was not about renewables. Everybody agreed that we need to develop and push to renewables. The challenge was coal phase-up, and the European was pressuring the Chinese and the developing countries to commit to reduce coal faster. And at the end of the day, if you look a year back, you can see that what happened, Europe increased its production of coal, unfortunately, and against all their objections. And why did they do that? So part of the question is, or part of the key challenge that we need to understand is energy independence. Because the Europeans, in a way, gave up their energy independence. They relied on imported Russian gas that really meant that in a situation of crisis, they lost their energy independence. So when you're looking ahead, you have to assess also the impact and importance of energy independence, and their loss of energy independence was partially connected to their climate goals, because we said, okay, we don't want to develop any more gas fields for our own, and they stopped developing their gas industry, and they relied on imported gas, and they found themselves, both in terms of cost of living and cost of fuel, and also in terms of climate, missing the goals. So I think this is one important lesson. But another important lesson to understand, if you look at the energy fuel mix in Europe this year, and you look at the numbers, you say, okay, they would switch back to coal because they had no gas. It's not the whole picture. The gas was very expensive, but Europe generated electricity in gas more than they did last year. 380 by September, 380 terawatt hours versus 354 last year. They used more gas. So why did they burn more coal? That's another aspect of the climate change. Look at what happened to the hydro production. They had a drought. Europe is drying, and the reliance on renewable energy creates another risk, because we are dependent on generation assets that are not dispatchable, that are beyond our control. We are dependent on nature, on wind, on sun, on water. So that doesn't mean that we don't need to push to renewables. Of course we need to push to renewables, but we have to ask ourselves, how are we prepared to maintain our energy resilience in cases that these incidents happen, and we know they will happen. So if I want to summarize the energy challenge from the European perspective, or what we learned from the European perspective, I think there are 4 key issues that we need to consider looking forward. One is our energy security. How are we providing and maintaining and assuring Israel's energy security in the coming years? But the second is also system adequacy. It's not only enough that we have the source of energy, we have to have enough reserves in order to ensure a reliable production in extreme cases. The third issue is the cost of living, is the prices. We need to consider or to maintain the risk of increasing electricity prices. We see that now today with increasing coal prices that affect us in Israel. And the climate challenge, adopting more renewables, reducing the carbon footprints. And those 4 key challenges, sometimes they push us to different directions. It's not a single answer. We need to balance, and we need to ask ourselves, when we are looking forward, how we balance these 4 key challenges. This is what I want to talk today in terms of Israel's energy sector. And I think the strong point today in Israel, relatively speaking, certainly when we compare ourselves to Europe, is our energy security. And take a look where we were just a decade ago, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and where we are today. Today, this year, about 80% of Israel's electricity productions come from local sources, natural gas and renewable energy. Only about 20% is imported coal. Look where we were just 12 years ago. 80% of our electricity was from imported sources. 60% coal, and of our gas, half of our gas was imported from Egypt. So we just in 12 years switched from 80% import to 80% local production, and even today we are exporting gas to our neighbors. So this is really a dramatic shift just in 12 years in our energy security, and this also affected us in our electricity prices. We today enjoy our energy independence every day, every one of us, in our electricity energy prices. And if you want to compare today energy prices in Israel compared to Europe, in some European countries there are even today subsidy or price cap. But if you look at the market prices today, electricity in Europe costs 4 times more than electricity in Israel. Natural gas in Europe costs 7 times more than it is in Israel. Of course, when you're looking at oil, it's a commodity, the price is the same everywhere. So our shift from coal and oil to gas and renewables allowed us today, and our energy independence allowed us to really gain a very important advantage relative to most European countries in terms of our cost of living, and it affects everything. It affects the inflation. Inflation rate in Israel, of course, it's high. We're reaching almost 5%, but in Europe, it's double. It's 10%. So in relative speaking, we enjoy the fruits of our energy independence. And in terms of cost of living, if you remember what happened in the UK just a few weeks ago, with the Prime Minister had to resign, part of the reason that she had to resign was the issue of energy prices and cost of electricity, and her plan to battle that. Because what did the UK government commit to? They committed also to tax cuts, but that's a different story. In the energy sector, that's electricity prices for industrial customers in the UK. It reached 400 pounds per megawatt hour, and the government said, okay, we'll create a price cap. We guarantee that the price will not go above 211 pounds per megawatt hour. That's double the price in Israel. But that was the subsidized price, and whatever goes beyond that, the government will subsidize. Of course, that was a check that the government wrote that the market was very concerned that there's no way to budget or to pay it, and it created a very strong devaluation of the pound and market turbulence that in the end caused the government or the prime minister to resign. So you see how the cost of living and the cost of electricity and the effect of energy independence is so crucial in modern economics. And part of our achieved ability, Israel's ability to reach this independence is, of course, the discoveries of natural gas here in Israel 14 or 15 years ago. And, you know, in global terms, we are not an energy superpower. We're a small energy provider. But relative to our economy, relative to the size of our economy, to our population, we are ranked number 4 among all OECD countries in gas and reserves per capita. Now, there aren't many sectors in the Israeli economy that we can say we're among the top 5 in the world. Maybe in high-tech, maybe in R&D. Yes, we are very strong in that, but not many other areas of the economy. And in this area, our ability to rank among the top OECD countries in terms of oil and gas reserves, this what gave us today the ability to enjoy lower electricity prices and to enjoy lower inflation rates. Looking forward, we have to ask ourselves how can we empower our other advantage, the sun. The sun, because relative to Europe, we also have double sun hours per year, and that's our challenge for the next decade, to see how we harness this advantage to our benefit. This chart shows you energy prices in the EU versus Israel, and if you look back, you remember the public protest against high gas prices that we had here in Israel in 2019. When we had gas price relatively high. It's very low. In historical perspective now, it's very hard to see that point, but you can see the period that gas prices in Europe was considerably lower than in Israel, but in long perspective, and I think this picture shows you more than everything the importance of energy independence. And from a geopolitical point of view, this energy independence today is translated also to regional trade. And if you examine, and just last month we had the agreement with Lebanon, which allows the development of the Karish field. And if you look at the regional gas reserves, and also what we gave up to Lebanon, the field that we gave up on paper, if it is discovered, is said to contain 100 BCM of gas. Our reserves today is 10 times as much. And again, compared to our population, compared to our size, you see that we are benefited from, because Egypt has twice as much gas as reserves as we do, but their population is 10 times higher. So in relative speaking, we are able to enjoy the fruits of this and export gas to our neighbors. And there are today discussions, and this was part of the COP27 discussions, of cooperation, further cooperation in energy. There is the Green Prosperity Project, which is talking about Israel exporting water to Jordan, and in return, and what is water? Desalinated water is exporting electricity. It's seawater and electricity. So in a way, we are exporting electricity to Jordan mixed with water, and in return importing solar energy, because one of the constraints we have to develop solar energy is land constraints, and perhaps for our neighbors, it's less of a constraint. So this is the good side, our energy independence, but we have also a few challenges ahead. And one of that is the increasing electricity price. And we saw electricity price increasing by 10% this year. We will see another increase of another 10 to 14% next year. It already happened because coal prices went up. We will see that forward. We have the challenge of electricity demand growth, inability to meet renewable energy targets, the delay in coal phase-out, the development of the grid network, and the transition to a competitive market. In terms of the electricity prices, this chart shows you the coal prices that IEC buys from the markets. And currently the situation is that IEC actually does not recognize in its income the full cost of coal, because coal prices went up and the tariff did not fully reflect it. So in a way, IEC is giving a loan to the customers. The loan will be paid back with interest. Don't worry, you'll get it back. But this loan will translate to about 14% increase in electricity prices in the next update. It's just assuming a coal price continue to go down. But the problem of coal is not only their prices, it's also our ability to phase out coal. And there are challenges and delays in the reduction of coal production. And I think that a national priority today is to accelerate the pace of coal reduction. We need to figure out, from a national perspective, even if it costs more, if it means taking a few risks, how to reduce coal usage faster. Just to give you an understanding, if we are able, today the plan is to phase out coal by the end of 2025. That's the national goal, and this is the plan. If we are able to push this earlier by a year, assuming current coal prices, we mean a reduction of 4 billion shekels in electricity prices. That's 15% reduction in electricity prices if we are able to push this deadline 1 year ahead. Is it easy? No, it's not easy. Will it cost more? Yes. But in the business sector, if I will take anyone here from the business sector, there is an investment that you're going to make anyhow. It's a 1 billion investment, 1.2 billion investment. If you will push it forward by 1 year, you will gain 4 billion shekels. I believe every measure should be made to make that happen, and I think it's a government role to along with IEC, of course, to take every measure to assure that we push this forward for electricity prices, but not only, of course, also for a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Because that's our next challenge, the reduction of emissions. And if we understand that we are not meeting our renewable targets, one of the ways to compensate for that is to push forward coal reduction faster. And in terms of renewable generation, as you recall, the target, the national target, was 10% renewables for 2020. We are getting close to that this year, but not quite there. We already have data for 10 months. We have 10 months out of 12. We are reaching about 9.5%. I think the Ministry of Energy will show different numbers because they have developed some very innovative way of calculating. But we are using here the international accepted way of calculating percentage from production, because at the end of the day, what generates the emission is a production, not the consumption, and we want to reduce the share of renewables from generation. But this is half of the problem. You know, we have a target of 20% renewables for 2025. That's just 3 years or 2 years and a half for today. There's no way we can meet this target, and we all know that. And even the targets for 2030 of 30% renewable seems very difficult to achieve. And today, I think even the Ministry of Energy understands that. This is a chart that was published by the Ministry of Energy. They classified the capacity needed to reach the 2030 target. That's 17.5 gigawatts by 2030, and they classified that this additional capacity, but what the government sees as a probability to reach that. So you can see that with high probability, not 100%, but high, there's about 12 gigawatts of capacity we can reach with high probability, and everything beyond that is classified as low probability. So unfortunately, I think the ability to reach the 2030 deadline of 30% renewable is we passed the deadline to achieve that. That doesn't mean that we don't need to push for this target maybe 3 or 4 years later. We still need to push for that. And as I said earlier, I think part of the way to compensate for the inability to reach this target is to push harder in other aspects of GHG reduction, which means, on the one hand, coal reduction, and on the other hand, electrification of transportation, where we can meet the goal easier. So, when we look at the energy transition, again, giving you a long-term perspective, and if you look at a long-term perspective, you see that it's already the fourth time that Israel is switching its fuel mix. In the 1990s, we introduced the coal units. And again, this was economic and also strategic decision of energy independence, because we were relying on imported oil, and after the oil embargo of 1974, and after in 1982 we returned to Egypt, our oil field in Sinai, we said we cannot rely on imported fuel anymore, and we built those giant, massive coal units that allowed us to reduce electricity prices and to gain energy independence, or to reduce our dependence on Arab oil. And in the 2000 years, we discovered natural gas, and again we made a shift from coal, started a shift from coal to gas, and now we are aiming for the fourth challenge of introducing renewables. And again, it's a challenge because renewable energy is distributed, it's not centralized, it's not manageable, it's not dispatchable. And going back to what I said earlier, we have to ask ourselves how we manage this energy transition to achieve our climate goals, and we must do it, but at the same time ensuring adequacy of supply, sufficient reserves, so we don't find ourselves in a situation like Europe did this year, that in a year that there is less sun or more or unfavorable conditions, we need to switch back to polluting fuels. All this needs to be done at a situation that the demand for electricity is continuing to increase, and we are talking about 3.5% average growth rate in electricity demand, fueled up basically by electric vehicles. I think this is very similar to what Sami Turjaman presented earlier about Noga's long-term projection, and understanding that electricity demand is growing. And for us in Israel, it's even more difficult than in Europe because our population is growing. We need 2% just to keep up with the population growth and to keep up with electrification and of transport. And, you know, in Europe, as the railway was electrified years ago, we are just now electrifying our railway. We are building electric light rail. So we have more challenges, not only electric vehicles, and the electric vehicle revolution, it's happening. It's not a question will it happen. It's already here. We see data for this year. We are reaching 13% of new vehicles on road in Israel. In the past 10 months are electrified. We're lagging behind Europe, but compared to the targets, the national target, when the government set the 10% renewable targets for 2020, they also set a target for electric vehicles for this year, for 2022. The target, which looks at the time as imaginary, was 5%. We're today at 13%. So you can see when the incentives are there and the technology is there and the government and regulation does not disrupt, the market can make the energy transition. And this is, again, what we saw here. And you are asking me where we will be in 2 or 3 years. You can see the European experience. From the European experience, the transition from 13% to 30% took 2 years. And they did it 3 or 4 years ago when everything was more difficult. There was no infrastructure and the supply of cars was lower. So we need to prepare ourselves to a situation that in 2 years we have 30% share of electric cars on market. And it's a great challenge, but not only a great challenge, because part of the advantage of electric vehicle charging that it can be managed. And it can be charged mostly at nighttime when we have surplus grid capacity. And actually, if we manage properly the EV charging, we are not creating a grid challenge, but we are reducing the cost of grid usage because it means we utilize the grid more efficiently. We are able to flatten the curve that we always want to do in electricity markets. So we should look at EVs. Of course, there are bottlenecks that we need to figure out, but in strategically looking, EV charging is part of the solution. It's not the problem. But in order to reach that, we need electricity adequacy. And part of the problem we see today, we are very close to the red line. We see more and more occasions that actual reserves is below the threshold of 10%. And you have to understand, in Israel, the last 10% in reserve today, it's solar power. We have 1,000 megawatts of diesel power. We have 1,000 megawatts of generations that is diesel only. It's the most expensive and uneconomic and unenvironmentally friendly technology. When we go below 10%, it means we're burning diesel. We don't want to be there. Not from a question of system resilience, not from a point of view of a cost of electricity, and not from the point of view of the environment. So we are under the red line, and we need to ask ourselves how we increase capacity. Solar energy is part of the question, but it's not the only solution, because most of those occasions are at nighttime when we don't have solar energy anyhow. So if I need to summarize, what do we need to do? What do we need to develop? Our challenges for the next decade in order to meet those challenges. And I think what you see here are the numbers from based on Noga's latest plan. When we look at their numbers by 2035, and we need to understand what is needed, we need about additional 4,000 to 4,700 megawatts of gas-based generation in the next 10 years until 2035. We need between 3,000 and 3,700 megawatts of storage, and we need about 16,000 megawatts renewables by 2035. It's a massive challenge. And I think the way to meet this challenge is dependent on regulation, on incentives, and also on market liberalization, because it's clear that we can't reach all these challenges with distributed storage, with distributed renewables, if we continue to manage the grid and manage the system in a central management system. We need to create incentives, and we need to allow the market forces to work. And I will conclude with these pictures in terms of market reform and competition in the supply sector. And this market is entering into competition. I think in January 2024, the ability to switch suppliers exists today. It exists even today, but from January 2024, you will be able to switch a supplier that also has their producing assets, which is a key element needed to provide real competition. And actually, you see that what is happening today in Israel, the European market did it already 20 years ago. So there's a lot of experience. It's not impossible. We need smart meters in order to enable that, and in order to enable, and I think we were late also because of government constraints and government policy. We were very late to introduce the smart grids, smart meters. We should have done that years ago, but it's too late. And part of the challenges is not only the generation sector, but also providing the infrastructure to allow competition in the retail sector. Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank all our three speakers, Mike, Prajeev, and Chen, for bringing us the perspective worldwide and locally. And we as a community are in charge to make it happen, and are in charge that the energy transition will succeed. So thank you everybody, and enjoy the conference.